What do you do when injustice walks right through the front door and
Why
no
aren't you
one
doing
dares to
anything?
stop it? If you're
Aren't you
someone who
angry?
values dignity, calm strength, and standing up without shouting, this story is for you. In a quiet roadside diner, a waitress is humiliated by men who think no one's watching. But someone is, and what happens next will remind you of the quiet power we all carry inside. Stay with us. This isn't just a story, it's a reflection on influence, legacy, and presence. Comment your thoughts like if this resonates and subscribe for more powerful, real-life wisdom. It was just after 7 when Chuck Norris pulled his truck into the gravel lot behind June's place. The sky was still that dull grey you only see in early winter before the sun finds the strength to break through. The wind carried a quiet bite, the kind that reminds you why folks here always keep a coat close, even if the calendar says it's not quite winter yet. The diner stood like it always had, a squat little building with weather-worn paint and a flickering neon sign that hadn't been fully lit in years. The E in June's buzzed faintly, just hanging on. But inside it was warm, always warm. Not just because of the coffee and the griddle, but because of the people. Familiar faces, familiar smells. And for a man like Chuck, who'd spent too many years on the road, there was something sacred about the familiar. He stepped in, the door creaking with a sound that felt like routine. A small bell above the frame gave its usual soft chime, and the smell of bacon, coffee, and something sweet in the oven drifted past him. He took it in slowly. This was his ritual. Every Wednesday. Same booth by the window. Same coffee. Same silence. That's what he liked best about this place. You didn't have to explain yourself. There were only a few customers that morning. A retired couple sharing toasts in silence. A young mechanic was thumbing through his phone between bites of eggs. The low hum of a country tune rolled from the old jukebox in the corner. Peaceful. Uncomplicated. Just the way he liked it. Behind the counter was Lana. She moved with the ease of someone who had memorized every creak of the floorboards. Not young, not old either, maybe mid-40s. Hair tied back in a way that said she didn't have time for nonsense, no makeup. Just clarity in her eyes, the kind you earn after life kicks you a few times and you learn to stand taller for it. She noticed him before he even sat down. Her voice reached him before her footsteps did. "Morning, Mr. Norris. You're early today." He gave her a nod. "I just needed some quiet before the world woke up." She smiled softly, already reaching for the coffee pot. She didn't ask how he liked it. She knew. Black, no sugar, no cream, strong enough to wake the dead, as she'd once joked. He remembered chuckling at that, and he didn't chuckle much. She brought the coffee over and placed it on the table without a word. He nodded again. She moved on. That was their rhythm. No small talk, just respect. She wasn't starstruck. She never asked for a photo or an autograph. To her, he was just Chuck, the quiet guy who liked his space and tipped well. Outside, the wind picked up. A loose plastic bag danced across the lot like it didn't know where to land. Chuck took a sip of his coffee and watched it through the glass, steam rising from the cup as the heat met the cold. He liked this booth. From here, he could see everything. The counter, the door, the corner where the kitchen swung open. It wasn't paranoia, just habit. Years of being in places where you needed to know your exits. Years of understanding that trouble rarely announced itself. Lana's voice rose briefly as she greeted a new customer, just a trucker passing through. The guy mumbled something about needing caffeine and warmth, and she laughed softly in response. Chuck listened without listening. That kind of noise became part of the atmosphere, comforting in its normalcy. He glanced around the diner. Every object had a history. The cracked vinyl seats, the chipped mugs, the faded photo of June and her late husband hangs on the wall behind the register. Nothing here was fancy, but it had a soul. And that mattered. There was something calming about places like this. places that didn't try to be more than they were. That kind of honesty was rare now. Everything in the world felt louder and faster, always pushing to be noticed, but this diner stood still. It refused to participate in the church, like it knew its worth without needing to scream it. Chuck appreciated that. In his line of work, he'd spent too long around people who confused volume for presence, around men who needed to dominate a room just to feel important. But real presence didn't need noise. It just was. And the people who knew that, they stood out. Lana, he noticed, had that kind of quiet strength too. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. There was something in the way she moved, in the way she handled things, that said she didn't scare easily. He'd seen the way she dealt with difficult customers. Calm, steady, never rude, but she didn't back down either. He respected that. It reminded him of people he used to know, people who did the right thing not because it was easy, but because they didn't know how to do it any other way. The clock above the kitchen door ticked towards 7:30. The regulars would start showing up soon. A schoolteacher who always ordered toast and tea. A mailman who took his eggs scrambled and hated onions. The rhythm of the town moved with the diner's hours. Chuck took another sip, eyes scanning the quiet room. He felt the peace in his bones, that deep kind of peace that doesn't come from silence, but from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. No show, no schedule, just the warmth of a cup, the weight of a wooden table beneath your fingers, and the hum of life moving gently around you. And then the peace shifted. It wasn't loud, just a low rumble at first, a motorcycle engine approaching fast, then idling outside. Another, then another. Chuck didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. He'd heard that sound before. Not the machines, the intent behind them. 3 bikes, parked hard, too fast for the gravel. One of them backfired like a gunshot. The bell above the door clanged not once, but twice, as it bounced against the frame. The cold wind rode in behind the men. Chuck took one more slow sip of coffee and waited. The air in the diner changed, not just because of the cold. It was the energy, the kind that creeps in and sits heavy on your shoulders, the kind you feel before you understand it. Conversations stopped. A fork clinked against a plate. Lana's voice didn't rise to greet them this time. It stayed quiet, professional, careful. "Good morning, fellas." There was a pause, then the scrape of boots against tile. 3 men walked in. Big, loud. Tattoos are climbing up necks. Leather patched with the names of clubs that didn't belong to this town. They didn't look like locals. They didn't act like guests either. Chuck's eyes flicked up just enough to catch their reflections in the window. He didn't move. He didn't need to. His body knew how to stay ready without looking like it was. The leader, clearly the leader, was wide in the shoulders with a shaved head, eyes sharp and mean. He walked like the place owed him something. His voice came low and smooth, but not friendly. "Nice place you got here." Lana didn't answer right away. She just stood behind the counter, coffee pot still in hand. He stepped closer. "Where's June? I was hoping to make her an offer." That made Chuck's brow twitch. Not visibly, but inwardly. Nobody asked about June like that. Not unless they were here for a reason that had nothing to do with breakfast. Lana stayed calm. She said June was recovering from surgery, the diner was closed for business, that the coffee was still hot if they wanted it, but nothing more. The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He leaned on the counter like he owned it. His buddies took seats at opposite ends of the room like they were waiting for something. Chuck felt it then, that shift, the kind that says the morning just took a different path. He kept his breath even, let the heat of the cup ground him, but the part of him that had once served in places far from home, that part stayed alert. Not yet, he thought, but soon. Because when people walk into a quiet place with noise in their bones, they don't leave without stirring up dust. And Chuck, well, Chuck had always been the kind of man who cleaned up after storms. It didn't take long for the room to shift from uneasy to tense. The leader of the group, the one with the shaved head and thick arms, slid into a booth without asking. He stretched out like he owned the place, one arm draped across the back of the seat, the other tapping the edge of the table with a steady, deliberate rhythm. His eyes didn't wander. They stayed locked on Lana. She stood behind the counter, hands steady on the coffee pot, her eyes calm but unreadable. Chuck watched her closely. He had seen people hold that kind of calm before. It wasn't peace. It was control. Quiet, practiced control. The other two men spread out in the diner. One leaned against the far wall, staring out the window like he didn't care. The other, broader and slower in movement, slid onto a stool by the counter, resting his thick forearms on the polished surface. The leader finally spoke again. He said he heard the place might be changing hands soon. He said he had a proposal, said he liked investing in small-town businesses. Then he smiled that kind of smile that doesn't mean anything good. Lana didn't answer right away. She was careful with her words. She said the owner wasn't here, said there was no talk of selling. She said if he wanted breakfast she could help, but anything else wasn't in her department. He leaned forward just a little, elbows on the table, grin still holding. He said he wasn't asking. He said he was just making conversation, but Chuck knew that tone. It wasn't a conversation. It was pressure, wrapped in charm, covered in false warmth. Chuck didn't move. He watched the reflection of the scene in the diner's front window. It gave him enough to see without drawing attention. He kept his breathing slow, focused. Because these situations didn't blow up on their own. They built in layers. And one of those layers was coming now. The man at the counter, the big one, asked Lana if she had ever worked in Vegas. He said she looked familiar. He said it like an accusation, not a compliment. Lana ignored him. Then he laughed. Said something crude under his breath. Something about how she moved. Chuck didn't catch the words, but he didn't need to. He saw the way Lana's shoulders tensed. Just a second. Just enough. Then she relaxed again, like someone used to swallowing insults instead of reacting. Another customer shifted in his seat. An older gentleman was near the door. He looked like a retired teacher, maybe in his late 60s. He pushed his glasses up his nose and cleared his throat, loud enough to make a point. That was his mistake. The big biker turned to him and asked if he had something to say. The old man shook his head, saying he was just clearing his throat. The biker smirked, then knocked the man's cup of coffee across the table, sending it spilling into the man's lap. The room froze. Lana moved, quick and silent, with a rag in hand to help clean the mess. But the old man waved her off. He stood slowly, his pants soaked, his hands trembling just a bit. Chuck watched it all. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. But something inside him shifted too. The old man turned to leave, head low, dignity bruised. Lana called after him, softly, but he didn't turn back. One of the bikers chuckled. The leader finally stood and walked to the counter. He reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the counter and told Lana to give it to the owner, said he'd be back in a week to make a formal offer. Then he added that she might want to polish her resume. Chuck could see her fingers twitch slightly as she took the card. But her voice didn't waver. She thanked him politely and said the message would be passed on. Her professionalism didn't crack. But Chuck had seen the crack already. It wasn't on her face. It was in the moment. The quiet after the customer left. The way the diner had swallowed its own noise. That's where the fracture began. The bikers stayed. They didn't order. They just lingered. talking among themselves and making jokes loud enough for others to hear. The content of their words didn't matter. What mattered was the tone. Dismissive, mocking, threatening by implication. Chuck stayed in his booth, finished his coffee, watched everything. Then something strange happened. One of the bikers pulled out his phone and started filming. He angled the camera toward Lana and began narrating, pretending to be a food critic. He described her movements with sarcasm, commented on her posture, said she looked nervous, said maybe she was hiding something. Chuck could hear the discomfort ripple through the room. A young woman near the back got up and left without finishing her food. Another man pretended to check his watch and made a quick exit. The room was shrinking, closing in, not from the number of people, but from the weight in the air. Lana didn't react. She finished wiping down a table, then returned behind the counter, but her silence now carried a different tone. Not calm, not professional. It was the silence of someone calculating how much more she could take. Chuck stood slowly. No sudden moves, no noise, just the quiet shifting of a man deciding that peace had run out. He walked to the counter and asked Lana for a refill. She nodded, stepped forward and poured. Her hands didn't shake, but her jaw was tight. He asked how June was doing. Lana said she was stable, resting, and that she appreciated the flowers he'd sent last week. Chuck nodded again. Then he asked casually if she needed any help around the place. Said he had some free mornings. Maybe he could take out the trash or fix the hinge on the freezer door. She smiled for the first time that morning. Just a little. She said the hinge had been stubborn for weeks. That moment, that tiny exchange, was enough to shift the tone again. The bikers didn't laugh this time. They watched. They didn't know what to make of Chuck yet. Didn't know whether to take him seriously or treat him like another regular. That was the space he worked best in. Later that morning, after the bikers finally left, Lana brought Chuck a slice of pie. Said it was on the house. Said she needed a small win today. Chuck didn't argue. He just took the plate and thanked her. Then she leaned in slightly, voice lower. She told him about a call she'd received. The man who came in, the leader, his name was Brick, not local, came from 2 towns over, had a record, had connections. Rumors said he was a front for a business group trying to buy up land around the new interstate project. They were targeting small properties, old businesses, anything that looked like it could be flipped or rezoned. Chuck listened. He didn't say much, just asked what June thought. Lana hesitated, said June was scared. She said she'd mentioned selling once or twice just to avoid trouble, but she didn't want to, not really. This place was her late husband's legacy. Selling it would feel like erasing him. Chuck nodded again. Then Lana added something else. She said Brick had known her name. Not just her first name, but her full name. And he'd brought up things from her past. Things she hadn't told anyone in town. Chuck narrowed his eyes slightly, asked what kind of things. She hesitated again, then said that when she lived in Phoenix, she had filed a report against a hospital administrator. He was hiding malpractice cases and endangering patients. She lost her job. Her name was in the news for a week, then forgotten. She moved here to start fresh. Chuck looked at her for a long moment, then said something quietly. He said people who do the right thing often end up alone for a while, but they're never really alone. Not forever. She looked at him, eyes tired but grateful. Then she nodded and went back to work. Chuck returned to his booth and finished his pie. He watched the room slowly come back to life. A new couple walked in. The jukebox played again. The hum returned. But under it all, he felt it. The tension still hung there just beneath the surface. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And Chuck, well, he had never been good at walking away when something felt wrong, especially not when the wrong people thought they owned the room. ChatGPT said, By the time Friday morning rolled around, the diner felt different. Not in a loud way. Nothing had been broken, nobody shouted, but there was a shift, a tension that didn't have a name yet. Just a presence. Lana felt it first. She moved a little faster behind the counter and checked the front lock twice instead of once. She glanced toward the windows more often, as if expecting something. She didn't say much, and when she did, her voice didn't carry as far. Chuck noticed too. He sat in his usual booth, sipping coffee like always, but his eyes weren't watching the street. They were watching the room. People. Patterns. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to see it coming this time. At around 8:30, the door opened again, but it wasn't Brick this time. It was a man in a suit. That alone set him apart from the regulars. The suit was clean, well-tailored, dark grey with subtle pinstripes. The man was in his mid-40s, maybe 50, with slicked back hair and an expression that looked like it had been trained in front of a mirror. He smiled as he entered, the kind of smile meant to put people at ease, but it was too practiced, too polished. There was no warmth behind it. He walked up to the counter like he belonged there, introduced himself as Reed, said he was a business consultant working with small towns, said he'd been hired to help improve some of the local properties. Lana gave him a neutral look, asked if he wanted coffee. Reed laughed lightly and said no. He said he wasn't here for breakfast. He was here for progress. Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly. That word, progress. It could mean 100 things, but when it came from a man in a suit who wasn't from around here, it usually meant one thing: change that didn't ask for permission. Reed said he was now acting as the temporary manager of June's place. June said she had signed a document agreeing to let him oversee the diner's operations while she recovered. He even pulled out a folder to prove it. Lana hesitated. She didn't reach for the folder. She just asked one question: why? Reed didn't answer directly. He said something about restructuring, about preparing the diner for possible sale, about making it more modern, more attractive to investors. Then he mentioned something else. He said there had been reports of workplace misconduct, said complaints had been filed, and that, for the time being, he was placing Lana on probation. The room went silent. Chuck didn't move, but his jaw clenched. Lana's hands didn't shake. She just stood still, like her body had gone cold from the inside out. She asked him what the complaint was, who filed it, what evidence there was. Reed smiled again, said he couldn't disclose details, said it was internal, said it wasn't personal. But it was personal, everyone could feel it. Chuck stood. He walked to the counter slowly, finishing the last sip from his mug as he approached. He placed the mug down gently. Then he looked at Reed. Asked if he had permission from the board to enact staff changes. Asked if June had signed anything in front of a witness. Asked if he had any authority over employee discipline at all. Reed's smile faltered for the first time. He said he didn't recognize Chuck. Asked if he was an attorney. Chuck said no. Then he said something else. He said Reed should probably read the fine print before pushing people around in places he didn't understand. Reed looked confused. Chuck didn't explain. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Lana and told her to keep doing what she was doing. Reed said she was on administrative leave and needed to exit the premises. Chuck said Reed needed to leave first. The silence got heavy. Reed looked around. The other customers were watching now. Nobody was on his side. He adjusted his jacket. Said he'd be back later that day. Said he'd bring paperwork and legal backup if needed. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed softly behind him, but the chill he left behind stayed. Lana stood still for a long moment. Then, finally, she sat down on the stool behind the counter, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Chuck leaned in a little and said one quiet thing. Just because someone uses the right words doesn't mean they have the right to say them. Later that afternoon, Lana got a call from June. Her voice was weak but clear. She said she was sorry. Said she'd signed something while on heavy medication. Reed hadn't told her it was about control of the diner. He had told her it was a permit for renovations. She had trusted him. Chuck asked if she still had the original file. June said yes. Said she could send it over. Said she didn't want that man near her diner again. That night, Chuck made a few calls. Not dramatic ones. Just quiet conversations with people who understood contracts, influence, and how small towns work. The next morning, Reed returned. This time with two men in matching sports coats. They looked like junior attorneys or overpaid assistants. One of them carried a clipboard. The other had a camera. They walked into the diner like they were walking into a courtroom. Reed announced that he was conducting a formal review. He said any employee without updated records would be temporarily suspended. He said he needed access to the back office and any financial documents. Lana didn't speak. She didn't move. Chuck stood up from his booth. He said Reed was trespassing on a property currently in dispute. He said any forced access to private files would be reported to the sheriff. He said he'd be happy to provide a copy of the legal advisory confirming that Reed's paperwork was under review for fraud. Reed laughed, but it didn't sound as smooth this time. Chuck walked forward, calm, steady, not aggressive, but undeniable. He told Reed that for someone who talked a lot about structure, he seemed really comfortable breaking protocol. Reed tried to talk over him, tried to raise his voice, but the diner wasn't listening to him anymore. Chuck said one more thing. He said June's place wasn't for sale, not to people who threatened staff, manipulated contracts, or let their associates harass customers. Then he added something else. He said people like Reed often forget that presence doesn't come from posture, it comes from purpose. Reed stared at him. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Uncertainty. Chuck stepped aside. Let the silence speak for itself. Reed gathered his papers, told his team to leave, but before he walked out, he turned to Lana. He said this wasn't over. Chuck looked at him one last time. Told him that people who threaten good folks usually don't last long in towns like this. Not because someone comes after them, but because people stop listening. And once you lose that, you've already lost everything. Reed didn't reply. He walked out. Fast this time. No slow strut, no smirk. The door shut hard behind him. Lana exhaled. Not relief, just release. Chuck turned back to his table, poured himself another cup of coffee, then nodded at her, like everything was back in place. But both of them knew it wasn't. Not yet. That afternoon, Lana received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a copy of her hospital whistleblower case from Phoenix. Highlighted sections, notes in the margin. Someone had dug it up, and someone wanted her to know they had it. Chuck looked at the papers. His voice was flat. Said this wasn't about a diner anymore. This was about silencing people who had the nerve to speak up. Lana said she wasn't afraid of them. Chuck said she didn't have to be. She wasn't alone anymore. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small key. He placed it on the counter. Lana asked what it was for. He said it was for the safe in the back office. Said June had given it to him years ago in case of emergencies. Lana stared at the key for a long moment. Chuck said she should open it tomorrow. There might be something inside worth remembering. Then he walked out. Just like always, no fanfare, no last words. But for the first time since Brick walked in that week, Lana smiled. Not because the fight was over, but now she wasn't fighting it alone. ChatGPT said. It was still dark when Chuck pulled into the diner's lot the next morning. The air was colder than it had been all week. Not sharp, not biting, just still. Still in that way that tells you something's coming, even if you can't say what. The gravel crunched softly under his boots as he walked toward the side entrance. He didn't use the front door this time. He didn't want to startle anyone, not after the last few days. Not after the shift did he feel a settling over the place. Inside, the diner was quiet. No hum from the jukebox yet, no clatter of dishes, just the ticking of the wall clock and the faint buzz of the overhead light near the back booth. He found Lana behind the counter, her jacket still on. She was holding the small key he'd given her. Not tightly, just resting it in her palm like she hadn't quite decided what to do with it yet. She looked up when she saw him, gave him a soft nod, said she hadn't slept much. Chuck nodded back, told her the safe was behind the broom closet door in the back room, bottom shelf, hidden behind a false wall panel. She didn't ask how he knew. She just moved. While she walked, Chuck poured himself a cup of coffee, black, still hot from the early prep. Lana had opened the place even though she wasn't sure she'd be allowed to stay. That told him everything he needed to know about her. A few minutes passed. Then Lana returned, holding a folder. Her face looked different. Not surprised, exactly, but changed. Like something had been confirmed that she wasn't ready to admit she'd been hoping for. She handed Chuck the folder. Inside were papers, letters, copies of ownership agreements, investment documents. Chuck's name was on several. Not loud, not bold, but there, in ink, in legal signatures. One letter stood out. It was from June, handwritten on her old notepad with the cherry blossom border. She had written it years ago, after her husband passed. It was addressed to Lana, though she'd never received it until now. The letter was short. June thanked her for staying. Said she knew the job was hard. Said she hoped someday Lana would consider taking over the place. Said she believed Lana had what it took to keep the soul of the diner alive. Chuck closed the folder and set it on the counter. He didn't say anything at first, just let the moment breathe. Lana finally asked him something she hadn't dared say before. She asked why he'd stayed all these years. Why does he come back week after week, year after year, never asking for anything, never making himself known? Chuck looked at her. His voice was quiet. He said that when June's husband died, most people walked away. Business dropped. People talked. Some said she should sell. She didn't. She kept the lights on. She brewed coffee. She smiled, even when her hands were shaking. Chuck said he saw something in that, a kind of strength he didn't see often anymore. So he invested, quietly, because not everything needs to be loud to make a difference. He said he saw the same thing in Lana, the same refusal to bend, even when the world leaned hard. They didn't speak for a while after that. Words weren't needed. They just stood in the silence of the morning, surrounded by the smell of coffee and fresh biscuits, and something else, something older, the kind of respect you don't say out loud, but feel. Later that day, a strange sound broke the peace. Chuck had stepped out back to get some air. That's when he heard it. A crack, followed by a low whoosh. Not loud, but wrong. He turned fast. Smoke. He ran to the front, just in time to see the fire catching on the hood of his old truck. Flames were licking up from the wheel well. Someone had shoved a rag into the gas tank and lit it. Chuck didn't wait. He grabbed the fire extinguisher from inside the door and doused the flames before they spread. But the truck was scorched. The damage was done. The sheriff came, wrote it down, promised to look into it. But Chuck could see it in his face. No cameras, no witnesses, not much he could do. Chuck didn't argue. He didn't need proof to know what this was. It was a message, and not just for him. That night, Lana found him sitting by the booth window. She brought him a fresh cup, said nothing at first. Then she pulled something from her apron pocket. A burnt corner of paper, pulled from the floorboard of the truck. It was a letter, half burnt, still readable in parts, a letter from Chuck's daughter. She had written it months ago. She said she understood why he kept his distance, said she didn't blame him, said all she really wanted was to know he was okay, and maybe, if he could, to try one more time, to come and see her. Chuck didn't say anything. He just held the letter, looked at it for a long while, not blinking. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat. Lana sat across from him. She asked if he had ever written back. He said no, said he didn't know how. She looked at him gently, said maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe she didn't need words. Maybe she just needed to know he still had the letter. Chuck nodded slowly. He didn't cry, but the silence that followed was heavier than words. Outside, the cold wind picked up. The sky turned a dull steel grey. Snow coming maybe, or something else. Inside, Lana stood and walked behind the counter. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. Chuck stayed in the booth a while longer, let the coffee go cold, let the words settle inside him. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was awake. The next morning he shaved, trimmed the edges of his beard, wore the jacket he hadn't touched in years, the one with the inside pocket for things that mattered. He didn't walk into the diner like a man looking for coffee. He walked in like a man looking for resolution. And whether the men behind this mess were ready or not, Chuck had already made his decision. He wasn't going to wait for justice to show up. He was going to bring it with him. It started just after sundown. Snow had begun to fall again. Not the kind that came with howling wind, but the soft, steady kind. The kind that blanketed the streets and softened the edges of every sound. Inside June's place, the windows had fogged around the corners, and the old neon sign hummed with tired resolve. Chuck stood by the front window, arms folded. He wasn't watching the snow, he was watching the street. He had been standing there for 15 minutes without saying a word. Lana knew better than to interrupt him. The diner was empty, except for the two of them. She had closed early, made up some excuse about a broken water line, but the regulars had already sensed something in the air. Nobody argued. They paid their bills and left with quiet nods. Chuck had asked her to lock the front door, then turn off the outside lights. Not because he was afraid, because he was ready. She asked what exactly they were waiting for. He didn't answer directly, just said it was time. At 6:13 p.m., 3 vehicles pulled into the lot. 1 pickup, 1 bike, 1 dark sedan. The doors opened slowly. Reed stepped out first, looking more polished than usual. Behind him came Brick, still grinning like a man who thought he had already won. The third figure was someone new. Broad, quiet, wearing gloves and a coat that didn't match the season. Security, maybe, or something less official. Chuck didn't move from the window. He watched them cross the lot, watched Reed adjust his coat, watched Brick light a cigarette and leave it burning just long enough to flick it at the snowbank. Watched the third man look up and down the street before nodding to nobody in particular. Then Chuck walked to the door, unlocked it, and opened it wide. The cold pushed in with the men. Reed smiled like they were just stopping by for dessert. Brick looked around like he was shopping. The big man said nothing. Chuck stepped back and let them enter. Then he closed the door behind them and turned the lock again. Nobody spoke for a moment. The 3 men stood near the counter. Lana stayed behind it, chin high, not flinching. Chuck walked to the center of the room. Then, without raising his voice, he said 5 things. First, he said, I'm not here to teach anyone a lesson. Second, he said, I just want to protect a small place built by good people. Third, he said, you think power comes from position or who your uncle knows, but it doesn't. Fourth, he said, real power is knowing you could use force and choosing not to. Fifth, he said, tonight I'm not choosing. The room froze, not because he shouted, but there was no hesitation in his voice. Brick stepped forward first, mouth already moving. He called Chuck an old man, said this wasn't a movie, said he was tired of the game. Then he lunged. Chuck didn't step back. He caught Brick's wrist mid-air. The sound was like dry wood snapping. Then he pivoted, pulled the man's weight forward, and dropped him hard against the edge of a booth. Brick gasped as the wind left his chest. His legs went limp. Reed backed up a step. The big man moved in, fast, but Chuck was faster. He shifted sideways, used the man's momentum against him, and drove an elbow into his rib cage. The man staggered, swung wide. Chuck ducked. Then his boot found the man's knee, and the joint gave with a sickening crack. He dropped to the floor, groaning through clenched teeth. Chuck turned to Reed. No words now. Reed raised both hands. Said he wasn't here to fight. Chuck stepped closer. Reed said he had nothing to do with the fire, with the threats, with the past. Chuck kept walking. Reed said he was just following orders, just a middleman, just doing what he was told. Chuck stopped. Then he said something Reed would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "Middlemen who carry poison still kill people, still deserve to be held accountable." Reed tried to argue, said he had lawyers, said this would get messy. Chuck nodded once. Then he pointed toward the window. Outside, 2 police cruisers were pulling into the lot. Quiet, no sirens, but their presence filled the air like thunder. Lana had made a call earlier that afternoon, not to the local department, to someone higher, someone Chuck knew from a case long past, someone who owed him a favor. The cruisers stopped. 2 officers stepped out, one in uniform, one in plain clothes with a badge on his belt. Their faces were calm, unreadable. Chuck stepped back. The officers entered. Reed started talking fast, waving his hands. He said he was attacked, said this was assault, said he had witnesses. The plainclothes officer asked one question. He asked if Reed had ever heard of a federal fraud investigation involving state redevelopment grants. Reed stopped talking. The officer handed him a document. It was a subpoena. Chuck had spent the last 2 days collecting evidence. Receipts, phone records, emails forwarded anonymously. The pieces had come together. Reed wasn't just a consultant. He was part of a network, buying up land tied to future government projects, then laundering the profits through shell companies, gas stations and strip malls. Rick was the enforcer. The others were puppets, but Reed was the one holding the string. And Chuck had just cut it. Reed was cuffed on the spot. No resistance. He didn't look angry, just hollow, like a man who finally realized the room had turned against him. The big man on the floor groaned again. The paramedics were already on their way. Rick was sitting upright now, holding his ribs, looking like he couldn't decide if he was more afraid of Chuck or the shame curling around his pride. Chuck didn't look at them again. He walked to the counter, picked up his coffee, took one sip. Then he turned to Lana and nodded. "You're right now." The officers filed out. The snow was still falling, slow and steady. Inside, the heat returned to the room, slowly, like it had been held at the door until it was safe to come back in. Lana stood taller, not because anything had been handed to her, but because she'd stood her ground long enough to keep it. Chuck reached into his coat and placed one final item on the counter. A deed, signed by June the previous year, naming Lana as the successor owner of June's place. Lana stared at it, then looked at Chuck, then down again. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she whispered that she didn't think she was ready. Chuck said, "Nobody ever is, but they step up anyway." She asked him if he was leaving. He said, "Not yet." He wanted one more coffee, one more quiet morning, one more reminder that not everything in this world gets taken. Then maybe, when the snow melts, he'd drive down to Phoenix. He had a letter to deliver, in person this time. The snow melted slowly that spring. It didn't disappear overnight. It lingered in patches along the sidewalk, clung to the shadows behind the diner, and faded from rooftops one wet drip at a time, the kind of melt that takes its time. Like the town itself, quiet, stubborn, set in its ways. Inside June's place, things changed in a way only locals would notice. The floors were scrubbed a little deeper, the counter had a new polish, the old jukebox in the corner started working again, playing soft country songs from a time when music had more soul than shine. Lana had taken over without fanfare, no grand opening, no big announcement. She showed up every morning at 5:30, tied her apron tight, and flipped the sign to open. That was her way of leading. Not through volume, through presence. She moved with more certainty now, not because she suddenly had all the answers, but because she had survived enough storms to trust her own footing. Confidence wasn't about being loud. It was about knowing what not to fear anymore. Most of the regulars didn't ask about what happened that night in the snow. They didn't have to. They'd heard bits and pieces. Some had watched from their windows. Others just felt it in the silence afterward, when people started coming back to the diner not because they were hungry, but because they felt safe again. And Chuck, he stayed a few more weeks. Not long, just long enough to make sure the dust settled the right way. He didn't hover, didn't act like a guardian. He just came in, sat at his usual booth, drank his coffee, and let the world move around him. But something was different about him too. He seemed lighter. Not in body, in spirit. One morning, just before he left town, Lana asked him what he was going to do next. He took a sip of coffee before answering. Said he was thinking of driving south, maybe to Phoenix, maybe somewhere quieter. Said there were a few doors he hadn't knocked on in a long time, and it was time. Lana didn't pry, she just nodded. Then she told him something simple. She said the seat by the window would still be there if he ever needed it. Chuck looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. That was all. That same afternoon, a letter arrived for Lana. It had no return address, but she knew the handwriting. It was from June. Inside was a photograph from years ago, the day June opened the diner. She was standing beside her husband, both in aprons, both smiling, like they had no idea how hard things would get. On the back, in blue ink, June had written one sentence. "This place is only as strong as the woman who stands behind the counter." Lana held the photo in both hands. Her breath caught for a second, but she didn't cry. She just tucked the photo into the frame of the register, right where June used to keep her favorite recipes. That was her tribute. Quiet. Love. A few days later, Chuck was gone. No goodbyes, no final toast. Just his coffee cup, washed and set back on the shelf, and a small envelope left under his plate addressed to Lana. Inside was a handwritten note, 6 words. "Thanks for not backing down first." There was also a folded piece of paper beneath it. A photo of Chuck, much younger, in uniform, and beside him, a little girl, maybe 7 years old, holding his hand. Lana understood then. He wasn't just fighting for the diner. He had been fighting for a promise he made to someone long ago, one he hadn't kept. Until now. Word trickled through the town over the next few weeks. The investigation into Reed's group had led to arrests in 3 counties, and government officials were stepping in to protect small businesses along the new highway corridor. That, for once, corruption hadn't gotten the last word. But inside the diner, none of that mattered much. What mattered was that the mornings stayed calm, that the coffee stayed strong, that the people who had once looked down when they entered now looked up. Because something had shifted here. Not in the buildings, in the people, especially Lana. She had started training a new waitress named Kayla, 19 years old, working her way through community college, nervous but eager. One morning, Kayla asked Lana how she handled rude customers. Lana smiled, leaned in and said something she hadn't said out loud before. You don't win by yelling louder. You win by staying rooted like a tree. Kayla blinked, said she didn't understand. Lana poured her a fresh cup of coffee and said she would, one day. That was enough. One quiet morning, just before sunrise, a familiar truck pulled into the diner's parking lot. Not Chuck's, but close. Out stepped a woman in her early 30s, hair pulled back, eyes clear. She looked around like she wasn't sure she belonged, but then she stepped inside. Lana recognized her right away. She didn't say it, didn't rush. I just offered her coffee, the same as I would for anyone. The woman sat at Chuck's old booth. She placed an envelope on the table, then looked out the window for a long time. Lana walked over slowly, refilled her cup, and waited. The woman said she was looking for someone. Someone she used to call Dad. Lana nodded once, then slid the envelope toward her. He left this for you, she said. Said you'd come when you were ready. The woman didn't open it right away. She just placed her hand over it and closed her eyes. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, just a little. Inside, the jukebox started playing a song from 30 years ago. And in that small moment, everything felt like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Later, as the morning rush picked up, Lana moved through the diner with quiet purpose. She refilled cups, took orders, shared soft smiles. And when someone asked if the place had new management, she paused for a second before answering. No, she said, just old values. New hands. She turned away, wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the next table. But if you watched closely, you'd see it in her step. That quiet confidence. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that says, I've been through fire, and I'm still standing. Out on the road, Chuck drove south. The windows cracked just enough to let in the breeze. The old letter from his daughter sat in the glove box, beside a fresh one he'd written in return. He didn't know what he'd say when he arrived, but for the first time in years, he was ready to find out. So, what can we really take away from this story? Sure, it's about a diner, a few bad guys, and a man named Chuck Norris who chose to step in. But beneath the surface, it's about something deeper. It's about the quiet power of presence. About how people with real strength don't need to talk over others. They just show up. And when they do, the whole room feels it. For those of us in our 50s or beyond, we know what it means to have weathered a few storms. We've led teams, raised families, built businesses, and learnt how to hold our ground without raising our voices. But even now, there's still room to grow, still space to sharpen the way we communicate, to show confidence without ego, to influence without force. Chuck didn't win because he was loud, he won because he listened, he observed, and when the moment came, he acted with clarity and purpose. That's leadership in its most natural form, and it's something all of us can practice, no matter where we are in life. So if this story reminded you of someone you respect, or a moment when you had to stand tall for something that mattered, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear it. And if you found something valuable here, something that made you pause, think, or feel, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of who we really are. Because sometimes, the strongest voice in the room is the one that speaks last, or doesn't need to speak at